Good morning, everyone. I'm George Christie with Wine Industry Network, and welcome to the opening session for our virtual conference, Growing Forward. The session is titled Optimizing Irrigation Practices in a Time of Change, but as one of our speakers suggested, we probably should have called it Adapting Your Irrigation Practices, and I think once you watch the session, you'll see why. Before we get into that, I want to thank our presenting sponsor, Lumo, for all their support. I also want to thank Turrentine Brokerage, one of our session sponsors, for their support as well. Those sponsorships really allow us to continue to produce good educational content like this and deliver it to you for free. So once again, thank you, Lumo, and thank you, Turrentine, for your support. Now, we always pre-record these sessions in advance, and we do that for quality purposes, but we also do it because we want to have as much interaction as we possibly can between folks in our audience and our presenters. So to that point, our speakers are watching this broadcast right along with you. They're monitoring the chat room. So as questions come to you while you're watching this, you don't need to wait to the end to submit those questions. Go ahead and submit them as they come, and the speakers will pick them off as they show up in the chat feature. Okay, so please take advantage of that. Okay, I think that about covers it. I think you're going to really enjoy this session. It's super interesting, and obviously it's super timely. Again, thank you, Lumo. Thank you, Turrentine. And of course, thank you everyone in the audience for being with us today. And let's get into it.
Over the last 10 to 20 years, there's been little innovation when it comes to irrigation for agriculture. Irrigating manually is very expensive. So not only do you have to turn all your valves on and off manually, which requires human labor, but you also have to use that labor to monitor your lines. Once the valves are on, how do you know that you're getting the water to the crop that you wanted? You might have broken lines or clogged lines, and all that requires labor, driving around on trucks. And labor's getting more expensive, it's getting harder to find, fuel's getting more expensive. So if you can eliminate that manual labor from your irrigation operation, you're gonna have huge savings. What Lumo is we're a smart irrigation valve, and honestly it's also so much more because we've got built-in sensors, built-in connectivity, built-in computers that allow that valve to not only be controlled remotely but also monitored and managed, so you have complete accountability around how much water you're using on your crop and that it's being used at the most efficient way possible. Also have this amazing software that you can use to easily schedule and also monitor every single irrigation. Every time you irrigate, you're given what's called a flow health report for that irrigation event. So did you see the health of an irrigation that you'd expected? Did the total amount of water get to the crop? Were the flow rates what we would expect, so that you can rest assured that not only did you turn the valve on for a certain amount of time, but you got that water to the crop that you wanted. And that's exactly, that's what the goal is for the farmer. And I'd say finally what Lumo is beyond just the technology, because farmers aren't just about technology and businesses aren't just about technology. We're a great team that is committed to providing 24/7 support to every single one of our customers. And so that support goes a long way to make sure that you're getting the most out of the technology, and that when there are potential problems, our team's going to detect that first, and we're going to show up and we're going to make sure that your irrigation is either fixed or done correctly every time. What our ultimate goal is at Lumo is to help growers conserve their most precious resources, which is time, money, and water.
Okay, JT, we'll start with you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, George. So JT Yeager, work for Jackson Family Wines here in the North Coast, cover Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino, and Lake counties. My background, a little bit about my background is, education in soil science, sort of learned viticulture through my, last 10 years working for a vineyard management company, consulting companies, and then now at JFW. I'm the viticulturist for the North Coast and, leading sort of research internally, trialing out different vendors that approach us, and then also really focusing in on bringing our vineyard development work in-house. So that's sort of me in a nutshell, but pass the torch.
Thanks, GT. Steve, why don't you go ahead and tell us little bit about yourself.
Thanks, George. Steve Vieira. I'm the director of vineyard operations for Derby Wine Estates here in Paso Robles. We've got 3 vineyards, totaling about 450 acres. They're all extremely different. One is more production based on the east side of Paso. The other is a little higher end in West Paso. And then we've got a cool climate vineyard in San Simeon. My background is in soil science. I'm a graduate of Cal Poly. I'm also a certified professional soil scientist. And my whole career is, prior to coming with Derby, I was for 12 years with Vineyard Management Company. And I've also continued to do consulting on the side for site evaluation, vineyard design, and that sort of thing.
So you sound very busy, Steve. Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, went to UC Davis for graduate school, and stayed there for 35 years. I was a research associate there, met Mark there while he was working on his master's and PhD. One of the things that I did toward the end of my career was created a viticulture course for an extension thing called the wine certificate thing that the UC Davis has, and taught that. And via that, I met a guy who was had a PhD in physics and had a vineyard, and it came time for him to retire, and we were able to speak the same language. A lot of times people in the wine business tend to want to talk about romance, but we just talked about science and physics. And it worked out really well for me. I was able to retire from there and come down and make the transition from being a researcher to an applied viticulturist. Well, at least I'm trying to make the transition. I keep on bumping into my inability to do what I really want to do, because you can't really do it with the tools that we have.
Well, we're going to get into that a little bit later, so we'll leave them hanging on that. And Mark, finally, do you want to tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Mark Greenspan. I'm a viticulturist. I was at Davis with Mike back before the internet, or at least before it was popular. And I finished my PhD in late 90s and went to work for Gallo. I worked for Gallo for almost 8 years. Ended up working as the manager for viticulture research in the North Coast. And then I decided to go off on my own in 2005. I started Advanced Viticulture as pretty much as myself, consulting in viticulture, with really emphasis on water, because my background has a lot to do with water and irrigation. That's kind of taken a few different directions since then. It's grown, and now we are about 80 or 90 people, kind of depending on the day of the month. We have a farming company. Most of the people are in our farming company, but I'm still a viticulturist, and that's kind of what I do day to day. Is besides pay bills, is do viticulture. I'm really interested in water and nutrition and sustainability, true sustainability, and I work with a lot of growers, mostly on all those things. On all those things, and I work also. I'm based now in the Central Coast, but I still have an office up north in Sonoma County, so I kind of ping pong between the two locations and work in both vineyards in North Coast and Central Coast. And I'm learning a lot more about Central Coast now that I'm down here. So it's fascinating.
Interesting. Well, thank you guys for that. And again, thank you for taking the time to be with us.
I need to interrupt for 1 second. You can feel free to edit this out, but Mark, here, nobody's going to believe what you said. That is before the internet. And I remember, and I say this to other people, when you and I had a conversation, and Greenspan said to me, "Are you going to get an email address?"
Sometimes I wish I didn't have one.
Mike, you don't have the gray hair I do. I at least look the part.
Right.
Let me start with this. And the term climate change has been out there for quite some time. But the term I'm hearing more often lately is climate variability. And I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on that and what exactly you've been experiencing. Mark, why don't you kick that off?
Yeah, I think that's really the aspect of climate change that wasn't discussed 10, 20, I don't know, whenever it was, 10, 15 years ago. Everybody was thinking global warming, and it's true on a global scale, the Earth is warming, but on a regional scale, what we experience is a lot more variability in weather. And so we say climate's kind of the typical weather patterns we get, but that's really changing. And what's changing is the weather, and weather changes the climate by virtue of climate being based on weather. So what we're seeing is more drought. We've always had droughts, but they seem to be more pronounced and longer lasting. And then we also see the opposite, flooding and extreme weather, rainfall during the wintertime, and sometimes extending out longer periods than we've typically experienced before. We saw that this year very strongly in the Central Coast with rain that does not normally occur here, in causing floods. And up north, we'd had years of drought. And this year, of course, we got that kind of reversed. And as well, it's not just rain, also heat. So we experienced, like, this year been very cool. Last year was very hot. We expect to see heat again this year. So it's variability from year to year, but also during the season. And while we always saw variance in weather conditions, that's why they call it weather, I guess. It just seems to be more extreme, and it's not just seemingly, it's actually measurable. And that really causes challenges for growing, irrigation, heat management, canopy management, planning of harvest. All those kinds of things kind of rely on weather, even variety selection.
Dave or JT, anybody, anything else to add to that?
No doubt, to echo everything Mark said, if everything changed in concert, then and that Southern England became Champagne became Burgundy, we wouldn't have any problem, because we know how to perform our jobs in all those different places. If Lillooet becomes Fresno, well, okay, fine. We know how to grow grapes in Fresno. All that stuff, if it changes in concert, it's the things that happen that are the variability or the unpredictability of what might happen. What do you have to do in order to prepare for the things that you don't know are going to happen? Because if all you did was think about what happened before, in the past, you're just fine.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll add to that is, the last couple of years, excluding this year, we were taking notes from our Central Coast team on how to manage water in early season. Normally we're thinking, turn it on the water May, June, and that just didn't cut it. So we were even having to start irrigating bud break, even sometimes in dormancy, which almost never happens here. I mean, Mark's got more experience in this region, but at least certainly not in my time. But
yeah.
But you had some data or some observations that told you that's what you needed to do.
Sure.
And that's what you need. That's what you're doing as your job.
Well, it's funny. Mark had said that, you saw the comment. Mark said that we probably should have revised our title instead of optimizing irrigation practices, really adapting irrigation practices in a time of change. So, how has your farming decisions, have they been impacted, or your irrigation decisions, are they much different than they were, let's say, 3 or 5 or 10 years ago, because of what we're seeing with climate variability?
I'll speak to that. I mean, really, it's just the biggest thing is adapting to what's thrown at you. And so in a drought year, the goal is always the same, but then it's what do you do to adapt to the situation? We've had multiple years of drought where cold winter and cold damage was an issue. So we tried to keep it moist in the root zone during the winter, because we just didn't get anything going on during the winter. And then, this year with the extreme wet, getting more moisture than we ever have, generally our row middles are bone dry, and we're really just relegated to the wetted area that we can create. Whereas this year it's the complete opposite, not being able to get into the field, or there definitely were no winter irrigations going on. And then how far can you delay spring irrigations to optimize the water that was put out? And so I don't know if the irrigation scheduling practices for myself has changed that drastically, but definitely adapting to what's put in front of you each year.
It sounds like just the need to be more flexible with your game plan. It almost reminds me of, in some ways, like being a coach for a sports team, right? You sort of just, you go in with a particular plan, but then the game starts, right? And you have to adapt or lose in a lot of cases.
Well, some of this stuff you can't adapt to. For instance, last year, the 10 days or whatever it was, 100 plus degree temperatures,
right.
There was nothing you can do during that time. The one thing I'm going to say is I know that could happen again. Maybe it never will, but I will not allow my vineyards not to have a canopy to protect my fruit if that kind of thing happened. And so
right.
that's one thing that I've done irrigation wise in my thing in anticipation of the odds. We're all playing a game of poker someplace, so there's an odds that this might happen. Do I want to get stuck there? I know that last year all the younger vineyards that I had that had very shy canopies because they were young were affected more so than the ones with larger canopies. So what am I going to do? Whose game am I going to play? So I'm going to make sure in the springtime now with my irrigation that I have enough canopy to protect my fruit should that happen.
It's interesting because one of the questions that were submitted from one of the registered folks was along the lines of, when a heat spike is coming, and let's say they haven't planned as well with making sure that the canopy was in place in the early part of the year. What sort of advice do you have for growers? Hey, we know next year it's going to be, or next week it's going to be 100 plus for the next 7 to 10 days. What sort of advice do you have for those folks?
I think Mike hit it on the head. Is you have to change your practices in the long term to prepare for the short term. And having it, I remember, again, aging myself, but dating myself, is back in the early 2000s or late 90s, we were pulling leaves, stripping them clean, because that's what we were taught to do. And that's not necessarily the university, but that's kind of, we took a good idea and made it, kind of blew it up. And now it's kind of gone the other way. I think, like what Mike said, we want to protect our fruit from direct sun as much as we can, at least in the afternoon sun. And so we've adapted our leaf pulling practices, even our trellis systems, a little bit to get more shade in the afternoon. But we always get asked about irrigation and irrigation in preparation for heat waves. Mm-hmm. And what happens if I do and I still get damage? Well, that's the problem is that fruit doesn't transpire water. Well, it does, but it can't control its transpiration rate. So irrigation doesn't necessarily help the fruit that much directly, but what it does is reduce the stress on the vine, and it can potentially reduce the damage to the leaves. So that's just as important by not having your leaves fry in the sun, because then you've exposed your leaves. So it is a little bit of a secondary effect. But irrigation before a heat wave is important, but it doesn't cure everything. But that said, being a consultant, I tell people to irrigate before a heat wave. Otherwise, if anything bad happens, I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
Mark, you said exactly what I thought you would say. Of course you have to do it, but if your vines aren't in good shape going into it, you can water it for here to 24 hours a day, and it's not going to help.
True.
Steve, anything to add to that?
Yeah, overexposure to fruit and lack of canopy, I've always felt it's been the biggest issue in Paso. Like Mark said, when I came out of school in the early 99, 2000, we were pulling leaves and everything was very, VSP. And we quickly learned that was not the right canopy system or management for Paso. And so, Paso's, particularly East Paso, is kind of a land of extremes. And so everything we kind of front load now, we want to make sure we have the right canopy to protect that fruit, the right trellis system and the right rootstock, because we know the heat's coming. And then when the heat does come, or you see it coming, you can't put on enough water. You're not going to, you've hoped that you've already done your work. But, instead of maybe one irrigation a week, I'll do 2 or 3. I think that kind of maybe minimizes it a little bit. But at that point, when it's getting 100 plus degrees, there's not a whole lot you can do. You just want to maintain moisture in the root zone. That's really it,
So, go ahead.
just quickly, I know we're going to probably talk about soil moisture, but that's really where we're knowing the soil moisture becomes important. Knowing what you have in storage in the soil. That's especially early season when we have a heat wave, which we often do in May. To know that you do have a good reserve of water. Sometimes we don't. I actually don't suggest irrigation if we have plenty of water in the soil reserve. And that's where I've gotten in trouble before I started using those devices, is not knowing what was really down there and kind of assuming the vines were okay. Yeah. Going into early heat wave.
So soil moisture monitoring, it's not brand new, but there has definitely been a technology impact. I assume it continues to get better. JT, can you talk a little bit about how technology is impacting our ability to monitor and the kind of data that you're able to gather?
Yeah, I mean, I think, soil moisture has been around for a long time, as you said, and it's not a new technology, but the same basic principles can be used with the changing climate, especially if you have historical data. You can use your soil moisture graphs. You can see that field capacity measurement at a given soil, and then you can irrigate on a deficit to a certain point and then maintain a certain soil moisture through veraison, and then hopefully continuing your irrigations through the craziness of harvest till at least senescence or that first major rain event. One thing that I will say is, a soil moisture probe needs to be placed pretty accurately within an average area of a vineyard, or else you don't get a good idea as to what that vineyard's doing, that vineyard soil is doing for the majority of that vineyard. There are AI and a lot of other technologies are coming out that are able to take that sensor and interpolate across an area, a larger vineyard area. So for a larger organization, this is kind of the key: scalability, the ability to take that point source of information and interpolate it across a large area. And so we're working with several vendors on trying to tease that out as well. And so I think, in the next 5 years, I think we're not even going to recognize the types of technologies that are out there to help us out. I think it's really just the tip of the iceberg.
Interesting. Anyone else like to pile on to this?
I think the soil moisture sensing technology hasn't changed a whole lot since 20 years ago, at least. But what's changed is the ability to move the data efficiently and quickly and inexpensively through telemetry, through cellular data and different other means of data transmission. So we're able to get the more information more often and at a lower cost. Mm-hmm. So that's why I think it's starting to spread more, is because of pretty much the cost factor. When it used to cost like $5,000 for a soil moisture station, now it's a lot lower, and I think that's a big part of it too.
Let's add for a second. I think that even if you're in the business of selling $75 bottles of wine, $5,000 doesn't really matter really anyway, if you thought that it helped you to maintain that. I just think that I think I have to give a lot of credit to you, Mark. I think that there's just a more awareness of the way to use that data to make really sound decisions.
Is there a kind of a rule of thumb with sensors per acre that you sort of use if you're looking for accurate enough results? Or what is that?
I'd say yes and no. It just depends on how variable is your soil conditions, because if you've got very high variability, going on a per acre basis is just not going to give you an accurate representation of what's going on in your field. But of course, if you have really high variability in 5 acre spot and you have 5 soils, you're probably not going to have 5 unless you're Screaming Eagle or something. And economies of scale, I guess, it's kind of a balancing act.
Yeah.
The number of sensors you're going to put in, to me at least, has something to do with your ability to deliver different amounts of water.
Yep.
If you cannot give different amounts of water, why have a whole lot of different numbers? And I wish you soil scientists on this panel would work with a bunch of other people to design vineyards that are better, so that the irrigation system is delivering water to a consistent soil type, and not just a piece of ground someplace. And furthermore, the irrigation systems don't deliver what they tell you they're going to say anyway. So what difference does some of this make?
Yeah, I mean, the dream is variable rate, giving variable rates to individual vines. Your replant,
Yes.
get different amounts of water than your older vines.
We've been talking about that since before you were born.
Don't pick on the kid.
Oh no, you're exactly right. But when we were your age, we were saying the same thing, and they still don't exist. And
I think. No, go ahead, Steve.
I was going to say, I mean, again, if you can be, I mean, how I got into this is, studying soil science at Cal Poly was, my internship was, I'm still managing the vineyard now, but basically, they put the vineyard in 20-acre blocks, irregardless of any soil type or aspect or anything like that. So, moving forward, you try to develop a vineyard somewhat around the soil conditions and the irrigation system as well. So then you can have some control over this. However, if your irrigation system in the vineyard is set up on a broad basis, you kind of got to go to if it's large enough size, if you have a 20-acre block and 15 acres of it is clay and the other 5 acres is sand, well, there's, what's your, do you want to irrigate to the sand at the expense of the other 15 acres? Or are you going to irrigate to the clay and the other 5 acres is going to take a hit? So you try to front load these things the best you can nowadays, but
no,
it's not always the case.
We could easily spend more time designing these things so that you didn't have to deal with that. Yeah. I mean, Mark, the Patrick Brown stuff with nutrition stuff, so we're over irrigating 30% of the vines, we're under irrigating 30% of the vines in order to get what?
Well, so the way I look at this now, your point is definitely there, and I think it's super important, and it doesn't often get done because people will just dig a backhoe pit there and not tie them together, which is something we're trying to do better with some other technologies. But that said, if you have a vineyard and you want it to be uniform, that vineyard's every vine's the same in theory. Every vine should be taking up the same amount of water, because transpiration is dictated by the amount of leaf area you have. Exposed leaf area is the transpiration source. So it's not so much they need more water or less water, they just need it differently. So yeah, heavier soils need more water less frequently, and lighter soils need less water more frequently. But in the end, they need the same amount of water. So that's where the challenge is in any of these soils. So when we go to a vineyard that we haven't planted or can't take any credit or blame for, there's always variability. Well, every vineyard has variability. So try to look at the weaker soils, because if we irrigate the weaker soils to how they want to be, the heavier soils are still going to be fine. Yeah, maybe we're not irrigating as we could. We could be using longer irrigations in those, but we tend to aim for the weaker soils, or the lower water holding capacity soils, because that tends to make everything more or less happy. It doesn't make it perfect, but it makes it a little more uniform. So it's definitely we're always battling uniformity or non-uniformity.
Mm-hmm. But we do say that water deficits in and of themselves change the chemistry of the fruit, so that you're differentially changing that chemistry of the fruit, and of course this consistent vineyard that you use as an example, we all have aerial photographs of our vineyards that say that's not even close to being true.
And in the highest end vineyards that was mentioned already, 1 acre blocks or less, soil probe in every one of them. Everyone's controlled individually.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, but there's a happy medium. Most of the wine we make is not $100, $200 bottle of wine. It's 20 or less, and we're gonna shoot for somewhere that's practical. but still, is even in a situation like that where we're not trying to make super high-end wine, we're still trying to make we're still trying to use water more efficiently. At least we hope. We hope we are.
One of the things that came up in our pre-session call, we talked about the ability to gather a lot of data, but in a lot of cases, you may not have a viticulturist on hand or just the time to be able to pour over all that data. So for those situations, at a minimum, what are you telling your the people that you're advising that they at minimum need to be paying attention to and looking at with regard to the data that they are gathering? Does that make sense, that question?
I'll go first. I'll go first. I think I do think you can do too much of a deep dive into data that you kind of miss the forest for the trees sort of thing. And so I think you've got to look at soil moisture. I think you've got to look at your climate, what's coming up. And then thirdly, I think you got to look at the vines and see how they're responding to that. And really it's those, you can't ignore any of those three. Let's put it that way. You can't just look at soil moisture data and have that be the sole driver of your irrigation practices without really going out there and seeing how the vine is responding or tying in the climate, what's coming. Is it going to get cool? Is it going to cool down? Is it going to get hotter than heck? So really it's the three of those for me.
Interesting. JT?
Yeah. Even for larger operations that have viticulturists, this is like more data, as much data as you can get isn't necessarily all quality data. There's only so much you can look at. I think I mentioned before, something called dashboard fatigue that term they're throwing around. You've got 5 or 6 different weather station vendors with all the bells and whistles, and you got to log onto each to look at each region or vineyard, or looking at soil moisture, looking at real-time information on vapor pressure deficit during heat waves. I think it's more just prioritizing what types of information are most important at certain phenological stages. I think that's sort of my approach. And then also picking technologies that maybe not weaknesses, but maybe help you out with some of your blind spots that you might have. Mm-hmm. So prioritizing things that maybe you don't feel like you're getting enough visibility on. And so that's a lot of times when we vet vendors, is this a need? Are we getting by? If we're just getting by, can we improve? And then sort of doubling down on certain areas to try and improve things that matter. So it's more or less.
Yeah. I like the way you put that, Steve. Kind of, it's yes, there's some good science out there, but it doesn't, take the place of being able there and actually see with your own 2 eyes, like how the vines look, or what weather you coming at. So you can't just grow grapes. It's not just all about growing grapes by scientifically. There's still a little bit of intuition involved. Mark, were you starting to say something?
Just wanted to add, I totally agree with the concept that you can't just look at numbers, even though I'm a total numbers guy. But I also believe that you can't not look at the vineyard. You have to look at the vines, but it's really a time of year especially important when you need to focus on the vine. For me, my opinion is the most important part is this canopy establishment phase that we want to slam the brakes on at some point, but we need to know when. When I say slam the brakes, I mean pull water back to stress the vines so they stop growing. But if we slam it on too early, you're going to have too little canopy, or if we wait too long, we're going to have excessive canopy growth, and then we have to deal with that, a separate problem. So to me, it's really about looking at the vines, but really during the spring and early summer. Once they stop growing, by the time we start seeing canopy symptoms, it's usually kind of overly stressed. When the leaves turn away from the sun or they start dropping leaves. That's when I think it's even more important to be looking at the numbers part. You just only look at the vines because, if they are starting to get overly stressed, you got a problem. But knowing what the soil moisture is, the plant stress values are, and yes, the weather are super important. But there's different times of the year where I think the visuals are more important than others.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mike, any file on there?
No doubt about it, Mark. That canopy part is the most the establishment part is the place you need to spend the most time thinking about your irrigation stuff. Once you get past veraison and the vine shoots that stop growing, you almost can't water it enough. I mean, I'm not saying that you need it. The amount of water doesn't really make any difference as long as it is enough. I just want to maintain the canopy at that point, because all this stuff about not watering before harvest is kind of a myth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There are more than a few different platforms out there that work with the soil moisture sensors. What's your advice for an operation that maybe is looking to add one of these platforms to their operation? What should they be looking for? What sort of questions should they be asking before pulling the trigger? JT, let's start that one off again?
Yeah, I think having conversations with that vendor on certain expectations, deliverables is a big thing. I think also project size. Oftentimes, if we do a larger pilot, it may be too much data to look at and make sense of. But if you don't do a large enough pilot, then you don't have enough data to be actionable during the year.
For me, it's one of the big things is who's going to maintain it, and if there's an issue, can they keep it running? Can they respond to an issue? Can they monitor if it goes down? If something goes down and you call them, can they respond? So really, it's the service, because I've had instances where you have something and then it's just like pulling teeth to get them back out there, and you've lost a month or two before it's back up and running. So, yeah. The service for me is big.
That's a long time. Mike, I saw you nodding your head there.
Well, I'm going to go back a little bit farther back than that. I think that if the vineyard management company doesn't currently have one, they need to ask why they want one, and that on their side, who's going to watch it, how are they going to make it work? Because I think that anything can work if somebody pays a lot of attention to it, and who's going to pay that attention to it. I do know vineyard managers who have the equipment and come to me and says, Mike, how do you look at this? I've had it for a year and a half. I don't know what to do with it. They thought it was a good idea to put it in, and they didn't really have anybody in their operation who would water it. So monitor it. So yes, on the side of maintaining it on the vendor side, but on you as a consumer side, who's going to be the person who's going to pay attention to it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think the other aspect of this, yeah, I agree with what everybody said, because they're the users of these, but I'm also a vendor. I don't make my own stuff, but I work with these companies and provide them as a service. And that's why my hair is gray, is because we're always trying to fix stuff. Nothing lasts forever, especially when it's outside. But the other thing that's important is, what do you want out of the system? Do you want to control your irrigation, or do you just want to monitor stuff? Because it's always cheaper to monitor stuff than it is to add controls. But more and more, we're seeing people wanting to automate valves, but also know what their wells are doing, what the status of their reservoir is, their tanks, what's their flow rates, how much stuff do you want? So it's not all, most of these systems can do all of it. Not all of them can do control. But
right.
What's also important is how flexible is this to how I want to see my information? Because if it's not visually appealing to you, or if it's cumbersome to look at, you're just not going to do it, and you spend a lot of money for nothing.
Yeah. Is that where you see the future going, Mark, where it's kind of an all-in-one, where it's, there's the monitoring going on, but then that's triggering based on, the values that you put in, triggering the irrigation? Is that really where we're going? Or do you think it's still going to be, a combination of human intuition, farming experience, and looking at the data?
I have not yet seen a system that was fully automated, but I see a lot of systems where there's monitoring, there's control, but it's really people, experts like all of us, looking at that information and making decisions on when to irrigate, the programming, the schedule into a computer or your phone, and having it execute. Maybe in some operations, yes, you could close the loop. We've been talking about that forever too, before the internet. is closing the loop on irrigation, but honestly, I just don't see a lot of it happening, and I don't really expect to see much, at least in the coastal farming. Maybe in the Central Valley, that's possible. But there's a lot of other factors involved with irrigation scheduling. It's not just when the vines need water. It's also, how do I get my water delivered, and how many blocks can I irrigate at one time, and how long was my minimum run length. There's all kinds of other factors that, yeah, eventually could be programmed into a system, but still probably be better managed by a human.
Yeah.
So let me add a couple of things, Mark. On your automation of valves, you wrote an article some time ago that really said to me how important that was. It wasn't that you automated the valves; it was that you were measuring the amount of water that went through the valves. That was the big thing. So like, we write these prescriptions for irrigation, but they don't necessarily are delivered the way that we write it on the piece of paper. The automation of the valves and the flow controls allow us to know how well that was delivered, and how good of a job the people that are doing that are doing. And I think that's really, really, really important.
And having feedback, kind of a real-time feedback, if, for instance, a valve gets stuck open or doesn't open.
Yeah.
And it should be open or it should be closed, and the other state is actually true. Getting an alert on your phone or telling you that something's wrong, and having someone run out there, because nothing's going to ever work 100% of the time. So yeah, but totally, yeah. We used to recommend certain amount of irrigations. They call for 4 hours, 6 hours, and it's on all day. It's on for 8 hours or 10 hours. But it's written down on the paper for 6 hours.
So I know that there are more important times of the year where you're really paying, let's say, closer attention to the sensors and the data coming in. But are you actually monitoring all year long, or tell me a little bit about that? Or is it really just during the growing season? Mark or JT, you want to start that off?
I was just going to make a comment on like soil moisture specifically. We use the winter months. I mean, obviously we're not like making any actionable decisions during those winter months off this information, because we usually get enough rain. We use those winter months really to understand where those soils are at field capacity, and that's really important information to have, especially comparing this year to last year. We look at historical data. That's not really going to help us necessarily with this year, but we have that data to show where that field capacity is, where our level is where we trigger irrigations, after our deficit. And so we have an understanding, because we have that real-time data throughout the year, as opposed to like just going out there for a single time point. We can have that reference. So I think having this data that's being recorded throughout the season gives us more visibility even during the season, especially with soil moisture as this example. But
Interesting. Anyone else want to pile on there?
Yeah, we definitely, I'm looking at it year round in the winter months. Again, I mean, this was kind of an abnormal year, but there's East Paso in particular is semi-arid, and going into the, do I need to irrigate during these months? How dry is it? Do I need to keep it moist in there? And then, months when we do, winters like this, when we do get a lot of rain, it's how wet is it? How wet is it? Or dry? Looking back years, you can see where you are. There's been years where, we got pretty good water, but then you look at the soil moisture, the long term, and it's actually drier than it was. So you just had a perception that it was wetter, but really in the 3-4 foot depth, something like that, pretty dry. And so, and then when do you trigger irrigation in the spring? Do I need to start earlier this year? Can I delay it much later than I ever have? So yeah, you're kind of looking at it. We don't get a lot of rainfall normally, so it's a big issue.
And even in the North Coast, not 22, but the 2 years prior to that, we were looking at soil moisture during the wintertime. And I know in February, I know both years, but especially in 21, we were calling our growers and saying, or emailing them, whatever, and telling them that, yeah, you should irrigate. And they normally don't turn anything on in February, but the soils were really dry. Vines shouldn't be let to get that dry. even though there's no leaves on them, they still need to be, the root system still needs to be kept moist, because water will move out of the plant into the soil if it's really, really dry. And in some cases, it really was. It's a site by site specific situation. But yeah, monitoring this in the wintertime, if we didn't do that, a lot of growers didn't do that. They had problems at bud break, delayed bud break or reduced shoot spring growth because of it.
Hey, Mark, I think you suggested you'd send me some notes on this about plant stress sensing.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that and what exactly you're measuring there?
Well, there's different types, but there's only one that I know of. The one we use is, and I don't really want to go into, I won't really, I'm not here to do a sales pitch on them, but FloraPulse is one we've been using. The reason I like that device is it's a first principle measurement. It's a tensiometer device that goes into the trunk and measures water potential directly in real time. And it's changed. It's kind of a game changer for us. And I think it will be for a lot of other growers who've been doing pressure bombing for 20, 30 years, like I have. Because it's measuring continuously, and having the continuous measurement to me is just really, really great, because it's really difficult to go out there and take pressure bomb readings on at least even a weekly basis. And pressure bomb is kind of our gold standard for measurement of plant stress, but this device doesn't measure exactly the same. It's measuring the trunk instead of the leaf, but it's still very close, and a little bit of an offset. So we're starting to use those on a large scale this year. We've been testing them for a few years, and we're really, really happy with them. Almost every one we've installed, we've done over 100 this year, and they're working great. With a couple exceptions, we got to move a couple, but it's a nice device. It just ties in really nicely with our soil moisture. So we can look at an event, and we can look at it that night if we want to see if it was hot that day or something, how stressed do the vines get, and how do they respond to weather? How do they respond to irrigation? We can see it right away. We don't have to, the weekly snapshots, which is what we were doing before, weekly pressure bomb readings, was only so good. It's a spot reading. Sometimes we hit it at 1 o'clock. Sometimes we hit it at 2:30. We're going to get a different reading. Now we're measuring it every 15 minutes. So how can you go wrong there? Yeah, the cost is higher, but when you factor in all the cost of moving around, because my company, we work with many vineyards all over the coasts, both in North and South. It costs a lot of money to drive a truck around. And plus you got to pay someone to do it. This is automating that process very nicely and efficiently.
And helping you, it's kind of one of the things you're looking at when you're making those irrigation decisions, right? So you're looking at the soil moisture and the stress levels, and that's kind of telling you a story. Do any of the other guys have anything to add on that?
Well, I have a question for Mark, if it's okay, but if you'd rather we defer this, why would you have a soil moisture and a plant-based and a plant water potential measurement in the same place? It seems to me that the tensiometer makes the soil moisture monitor not necessary.
Oh no, I mean, I think it's a perfect adjunct. You probably lead me on with that question.
Yeah, well,
kind of set it up on a T.
So how does pre-dawn on your tensiometer compare with soil moisture?
It's interesting. We're still learning about that. I think I do see it kind of floating there close to zero bars when early spring, and then now we're starting to see it drop down. It is a kind of an adjunct to a water potential, soil water potential at pre-dawn when everything's kind of at equilibrium. But it doesn't replace the soil moisture device, because really I want to know. I'm getting so much more out of the soil moisture device. Plus, we're not measuring water potential of the soil; we're measuring water content, and I'm looking at it 6 or 12 depths of the soil, so we can see where the irrigations are going. We can see where the moisture reserves are. To me, not knowing what the soil moisture is what I did for years. I was only looking at the plant. I was a plant guy, plant stress guy, and I still am, but I missed out on a lot of information by not knowing where the water reserves were in the springtime, knowing where the active roots are, and knowing how deep my irrigations go and how long they reside there before it's fully taken up. So to me, it's a perfect adjunct to it. I can it's just like knowing, it's almost like 50-50. You need to know what's happening below the ground, and you need to know what's happening above the ground, and the two really work together very well. I don't see one being a replacement for the other at all.
But it's just that the vine is below and above itself.
True. Yeah.
And its roots are where the roots are, right?
Right.
And the soil moisture probe is like wherever you put it.
Sure. I agree that. Yeah. Okay. You're talking like a scientist, not a practical practitioner. Everyone's it's gonna depend on where you locate it underneath the dripper, how far, even if 6 inches will make a difference, and it's true, it will. But you still, and I look at the soil moisture devices, when I look at them, we don't have the ability to show that information now, but I look at it qualitatively. I look at the shape of when the spike goes with the irrigation, how far down does that go? And then I look at the depletion pattern, and when it starts to run out of water, I can see that. I almost don't care about what the y-axis is, so I don't really look at it quantitatively. I'm really looking at the shape, and that gives me enough information along with the plant to get a pretty damn good prescription on irrigation, I think.
JT, or Steve, you guys doing any incorporating some stress monitoring as well in conjunction with your soil moisture monitoring?
Yeah, it's funny that you ask, because we actually are starting to dabble in this type of technology. Issue of scale, sending someone out to monitor with pressure bomb different blocks, management areas, and you ultimately end up taking samples at 10 in the morning, and you end up taking samples, measurements at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. So really only a small amount of the samples are in the ideal window. And so with this tensiometer, for example, you have that real-time data. You can actually look and see, what it is at noon, or when the sun's the highest in the air. And then, on cloudy days too, as well, a lot of times here on the North Coast, I'm sure it's the same down in the Central Coast, but the fog won't burn off until noon or 1 p.m. So you've essentially missed that day of sampling. So being able to have continuous measurements of a plant water stress parameter, I think is going to be at least a big game changer for JFW. But I think it's something that people should be looking into, just trying to understand that type of plant stress measurement.
Thank you, JT. Steve, was there anything that you wanted to comment on?
Oh, again, the pressure bomb, it's absolutely useful. However, it's just so labor intensive, and the amount of variability, and when can somebody get out there, and who's reading it, and it's just like kind of abandoned it. But I think this new technology, which I'm not using, but it is the next, kind of the tying in soil moisture to how the plant is responding. Because at the end of the day, like Mark said, you really, there's almost nothing, unless you're in a flood irrigation sort of system, nothing that's going to tell you how much water to put on, and not only so you can kind of see how much you've put on, present, past tense, versus how soil moisture is responding and how the vine is responding. And then of course you have to make a schedule for next week or the next 2 weeks. And so the more information, at least on the soil moisture side, climate side, and the plant side, you can start to come up with a more educated guess, if you will, because there's nothing out there that I know of that comes up with a number and spits it out, and that's exactly what, looking crystal ball, that's going to tell you that. So you've got to really kind of interpret a lot of data and see how the vine's reacting and what you've done and how it's reacted.
That's pretty interesting stuff. Mark, where you're employing this, is it the same same sort of philosophy that you have with your soil moisture sensors, or that you're going to pick what you think is an average vine that's maybe in like one per acre, because that area is pretty similar? Or are you like trying to put them on as many vines as possible? Like, how does that?
No. Well, we'd all go broke. So we try to find a representative vine, just like the soil. So we're always measuring at the same location mainly because of the practicality of the telemetry. Every one of these locations has a radio node, and to reduce the cost. But also, we picked that location again because it's not necessarily the average, but we actually look for the weaker zone. Not sick, not diseased, but weaker. And when I say weaker, I mean like lower water holding capacity soil, someone that tends to be perpetually more difficult. And we kind of put our location to monitor that location and extrapolate that, at least mentally, across the whole vineyard. But yeah, it's a little bit of art, it's a little bit of science, and a little bit of technology. It's all kind of comes together. It's not perfect, but it seems to work.
Well, this has been really terrific, guys. We're kind of getting towards the end of our time here. Maybe just a parting thoughts on, anybody out there who's hasn't employed some of the technology that's available, and what your recommendations are for them that are maybe on the cusp of making that decision. We'll kind of end with that. And Mike, why don't you start that your parting thoughts on that?
Grab technology when you can, collect the data, but first have somebody to look at it. It's going to help you make huge decisions that will increase the quality and quantity depending on your goals of your fruit. Do that.
Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I think look at technology and look at look at the whole picture, and what are your goals? Where would you like to improve, and can some of these tools help you? And then employ. I mean, I've looked at soil moisture stuff for a long time, but I've called Mark, hey, take a closer look and give me your thoughts on this, because I know Mark's looked at it. He's got miles more experience than I do. So don't be afraid. You don't have to do it all yourself. Get somebody with some good experience to aid you as well.
JT?
Yeah, I think just more data doesn't necessarily mean better. Sort of pick and choose what types of data matter the most, and what can help your farming the most. And then another thing is, if the technology isn't working for you, don't be afraid to jump ship. Choose something different, something that works better for you. We've done that, many times in the past, and so try not to force something that's not going to work. And there's plenty of opportunities, plenty of different vendors out there. So just start trying them out and seeing what works for you.
Thank you, JT. And Mark, we'll let you have the last word.
Okay. Well, I mean, what everybody said is kind of what I would wrap up and kind of tie it up with a bow by saying, there's don't buy technology unless you're going to use it. The thing is, it's not that complicated if you really kind of look at it. I learned how to look at this stuff by some other people, so it wasn't my ideas. But they were able to show me that it's not that difficult. This is how you look at it. And so looking at the soil moisture kind of turned me on, switched me on. It was kind of late in my career. It was 2010 when I really started using soil moisture. And I've been using the other devices for a long time. But let somebody, you either you hire someone like me to help you interpret the data, which I'm happy to do, and I always will be. But I can also kind of help you learn how to interpret the data. It's just numbers, unless you can get information out of it, and not. And once you see that, it's almost like a light bulb turning on your head. It says, "Oh yeah, I'm getting it," and that's why I like to see people. I like to see that happen to people. But if it doesn't, then I'm always happy to interpret it for them and tell them every week, this is what you got to do.
Well, listen, guys, this has been really interesting. Once again, I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us and produce this session. Of course, I want to thank Lumo for being our presenting sponsor. along with Turntime Brokerage as a session sponsor, and all of you for taking the time to be with us today. All right, guys, thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too.
Thank you.